I'd like to welcome everyone to our third Center for Chinese Studies Scholars Forum. My name is Michael Berry. I'm the director of the Center for Chinese Studies, and it is a great pleasure to be with everybody today. The Center for Chinese Studies hosts a variety of different types of events. We have artist talks, scholarly lectures, teach-ins, and one of the new formats that we began a little less than a year ago were the Scholars Forum, which is an attempt to bring together professors, faculty, graduate students, lecturers from the UCLA Chinese Studies community to share their research to disparate audiences and mostly to build bridges amongst the UCLA Chinese Studies community. And so one of the strange aspects of this forum is that we pair up scholars from different backgrounds with different training, coming from different disciplines. And the idea is to build communities, to build intellectual connections where maybe they might not normally be found. And so each session we pair up anthropologists, with economists, with people from all over campus. And today it's my great pleasure to introduce our three speakers who represent, two different fields, but also there are two historians, but also working on different aspects of Chinese history. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. Each speaker will have approximately 20 minutes to deliver their lecture, and then we will open up the floor to discussions, which you can type in the chat function, and hopefully we'll have a lively dialogue. Our first speaker is Professor Richard von Glahn. He is distinguished professor of history at UCLA and the author of numerous articles and books on Chinese history, including Fountain of Fortune, Money and Monetary Policy in China, 1000 to 1700, The Economic History of China from Antiquity to the 19th Century, and he is most recently co-editor of the Cambridge Economic History of China. Our second speaker will be Professor Helen Rees. She is professor of ethnomusicology at UCLA. Previously, she studied at the Shanghai Conservatory of Music and has done a lot of field research in Yunnan over the years. She is the author of Naxi Music in Modern China and has also collaborated on the production of 13 CDs of Yunnan music. And I think part of her talk today will also be talking about the kind of creative side and her interactions with filmmaking and recording music. And finally, our third speaker will be Sunkyu Lee, a PhD candidate in history at UCLA. Her dissertation shows how maps shape the imagination of political boundaries in Ming era China. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over the microphone to my colleague, Professor von Glahn.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for all of your efforts to support the community and to keep us in touch with each other during these very difficult times. And thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. What I'm going to be talking about today, let me get my PowerPoint up, is a small part of a larger project on exchange in maritime East Asia from the 9th to the 17th centuries. I'm going to be specifically talking about the phenomenon of Wokou, or Wokou in Japanese, that is to say Japanese piracy, which is usually studied from the perspective of piracy, as the name suggests. This painting commemorating the defense of a Chinese city against a Wokou attack, a very vernacular style painting. What I particularly like about it is that all of the Wokou pirates here are shown, down here as well, are shown holding a Japanese curved sword in one hand and a folded fan in the other hand. The folded fan was an import from Japan that had become a significant part of elite Chinese culture since the Song dynasty. It was really the ultimate emblem of being Japanese. So we see in this picture that the attackers are being identified as Japanese through these particular emblems. But in fact, the Wokou were neither Japanese nor pirates. Instead, they were multinational merchant companies who, in response to the Ming maritime ban on overseas trade, had turned to smuggling, especially in the 16th century, silver from Japan, where the silver strikes in the 1520s, the Iwami mines had set off a real boom. In response to the smuggling and this enhanced smuggling in 1548, the Ming launched a military offensive against the Wokou that led to a full-scale war for the next decade. There are a whole series of genre paintings showing the Ming resistance to pirate attacks, although indeed it was the Ming who launched the offensive. And one thing I just want to draw attention to in this particular illustration is the Portuguese swivel cannon down here mounted on the Wokou ship. The use of gunpowder weapons also becomes an important part of this story. After a decade plus of war, the Ming triumphed in a military sense, but it was a very costly victory that led to the repeal of the ban on overseas trade in 1567, a key moment not in just Ming history, but indeed in global history that led to the formation of the first truly global trade network that was centered above all on the Chinese import of silver from Japan and also from Spain's colonies in the Americas. But what I want to do today is to look at this moment in East Asian history as a moment when an alternative to the Chinese model of the bureaucratic agrarian empire emerges in the form of what I'm calling here the port polity. That is to say, a state whose political economy is based not on land revenues, but rather on the profits of maritime trade. There are various examples of this across the East Asian maritime world: the Ryukyu Kingdom in the Okinawa archipelago, the Win regime in central Vietnam, the European colonial footholds in Macau, Manila, Batavia, in Japan, as we'll be talking about as well. And perhaps we can also include the 17th century Zheng regime in coastal China and Fujian and Taiwan as well. So these port polities then are founded on an alliance between merchants, above all Chinese, but really multinational companies of merchants, and the rulers of these states. And I'm going to examine this port polity relationship through two figures, that of Wang Zhi, one of the Wokou captains, the most renowned of them, and Otomo Sorin, one of the daimyo in Kyushu in southern Japan. Wang Zhi was from Huizhou, the famous center of merchants who had abandoned the salt trade for maritime commerce. He first appears in the historical record in 1540 when he and another investor build a large ship at Guangzhou that they use to carry sulfur, silk, and cotton goods to Siam, to Thailand. The Wokou operate primarily out of Shuangyu here off the coast of Ningbo. And we're mostly engaged with trade in Southeast Asia and in Japan. The Shuangyu was said in the 1540s to also have a colony of about 3,000 Portuguese. So again, very much a multinational setting. In 1542, when Wang Zhi was returning on a voyage from Siam, his ship was blown off course and wound up landing at Tanegashima, this island here off the southernmost coast of Kyushu in Japan. that was a momentous event in its own right. He was carrying Portuguese passengers, and at this moment in time, the Portuguese were not traveling on their own ships in East Asia. Instead, they were on the so-called Wokou ships. So they brought the first Portuguese to Japan, and also the first gunpowder weapons, which will have a very transformative impact on the civil wars that were then raging in Japan. The Kyushu daimyo were very much engaged in these civil wars, competing for hegemony both within the island of Kyushu and really for overall supremacy in the Japanese archipelago. They sought to capitalize on foreign trade, again, this trade of silver to China, and now the Portuguese as potential allies, especially to gain access to gunpowder weapons. The person or the daimyo that I'm going to talk most about is the Otomo here in northeastern Kyushu. Their capital is at Bungo Funai, which is the modern city of Oita. The Otomo daimyo had long been active in tribute missions to the Ming, but the Ming had suspended those exchanges in 1523. In 1543, the Otomo sent their own mission to Ningbo. It was rejected. Before returning to Japan, they stopped at Shuangyu and engaged in some trade with the Chinese merchants there, and also picked up Wang Zhi and brought him back to Bungo Funai. And from that point, we begin to see the Wokou, Wang Zhi and other Wokou captains developing very close relationships with the daimyo in Kyushu. The trade really booms in the 1540s. Wang Zhi actually winds up settling not at Bungo Funai, but over here at Hirado in the Matsura domain. Again, because this trade is booming, the Ming launched their offensive against Shuangyu in 1548. Wang Zhi, by virtue of being in Japan at the time, was one of the few Wokou leaders to survive. But Wang Zhi did not join in on the Wokou reprisals against the Ming, the Wokou attacks on Ming settlements and cities. He was very much a businessman. Piracy was bad for business. He tried to negotiate with the Ming. He even would, on occasion, send back captured pirates to the Ming to demonstrate his loyalty to the Ming emperor. So he's engaging in this more or less constant process of negotiation with Ming envoys. The Ming envoys found him arrogant. He was calling himself king of the Pacific Seas, the Ping Hai Wang. He was holding court at his great estate in Hirado and expecting lots of deference from the Ming envoys. And Hirado itself was turning into a real boom town. A Japanese courtier who came from Kyoto at this moment in time referred to Hirado as the capital, the Miyako of the West, the parallel to the Miyako, the capital of Kyoto itself. In 1556, the Ming envoys offered trade privileges to Wang Zhi, and he accepted that offer, returned with them to Ningbo, but once he arrived in Ningbo, he was imprisoned. The Ming court deliberated whether to honor their offer, but in the end decided not to, and eventually Wang Zhi was executed. At this point in time, the Otomo were the most aggressive daimyo in trying to build a port polity. Otomo Sorin succeeds his father in 1551. He maneuvers to place his brother as the daimyo of Yamaguchi, which had been the previous base from which the Japanese tribute missions had been sent to China. He launches his own efforts to send missions to China, He also tries to cultivate relations with the Portuguese. He invites Francis Xavier to come to Bungo, allows him to build a monastic establishment there, nominally declares his conversion to Christianity, but he's mostly interested in the Portuguese merchants. And it's interesting to see from the Portuguese perspective how significant Bungo was in their perception of Japan at this time. This Portuguese map of Japan from the late 16th century shows Bungo down here in what, at least to my naked eye, looks like the largest castle, except for the other Miyako, Kyoto, the capital here. Indeed, the whole island of Kyushu is actually labeled Bungo, as you can see here. And the real Portuguese interest in Japan is indicated by the fact that other than cities, the only other place name is the Argenti Fodini, the silver mines of Iwami up here on the western coast of Honshu. This is a map of the city of Bungo Funai. You can see the daimyo's mansion and headquarters here at the center. If we look at the schematic diagram, this is down here is the Otomo daimyo headquarters. We can see that the Chinese quarter, the Tojinmachi, is right here, right in front of the Otomo residence. Over here is the residence of the most prominent Japanese merchant in town. So you can see how the Chinese were really occupying the center of the city, and not just merchants, but artisans, doctors, and others as well had come to Funai. The Portuguese church and monastery is over here, and there's a whole row of Buddhist temples, and so they're ensconced on the margin of the city with the other temples, as it were. In 1556, Sorin and his brother send a mission to Ningbo. They have the seal that was previously used by the Japanese tribute missions, reproduced here. But when, and of course, it's arriving just after Wang Zhi has been imprisoned and when tensions are at their height. So this mission was not received as proper envoys, instead treated as Wokou. Their ship was scuttled. Undaunted, Sorin sends missions to Siam, to Goa, to Europe. He sends the first mission, Japanese missions to Europe that travels to Lisbon, the Portuguese capital, and also to see the Pope in Rome. But thereafter, Sorin suffers a series of setbacks. In 1566, his brother Yoshinaga is defeated by the Mori. They lose the province of Yamaguchi. The Mori gain control of the Iwami silver mines. In 1571, the silver mines would be up here. Again, this is map shows the Mori in control of this region. And the Portuguese had shifted their attention away from Bungo Funai to Hirado, because it was much easier access to the actual sources of silver. But in 1570, the Portuguese established a new trading base at Nagasaki. The Omura daimyo offer more favorable accommodations to the Portuguese, including conversion to Christianity. The Matsura daimyo had refused to do so. So the Portuguese from 1570 onward are really basing all of their trade operations here at Nagasaki, and Bungo Funai is left out in the cold. Also at this time, the civil wars are intensifying, now fueled by the muskets and cannons supplied by the Wokou and the Portuguese. Oda Nobunaga's victory at Nagashino in 1575 was decisive in his march toward unification of Japan. In 1586, Bungo Funai is sacked and razed by the Shimazu daimyo, their rivals down here in southern Kyushu. And that effectively put an end to the Otomo ambitions of a maritime empire and of achieving political supremacy within the archipelago. The trio of unifiers, Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, Tokugawa Ieyasu, all pursued a mercantilist model of state building based on commercial wealth. That it represents, again, this kind of port polity phenomenon that I'm referring to. The unifiers all established monopolies on silver mines and foreign trade. The building of the castle towns was entrusted to privileged merchants, often those engaged in foreign trade. They issue new silver currencies in order to facilitate collection of revenues and the building of their war chests. Hideyoshi, of course, builds a navy to launch the invasions of Korea in the 1590s. This is the port that he builds out of nothing, Karatsu, in Kyushu to launch the invasions. And we see some of the huge Japanese battleships, the Akebune, leaving the harbor in this painting. When Tokugawa Ieyasu comes to power at the beginning of the 17th century, he encourages foreign trade under the so-called Red Seal licenses that are granted not just to Japanese, but to foreign merchants as well. Here we have a painting of a Red Seal ship coming from Nagasaki. It's a large ship, it has over 200 merchants, according to the inscription here, pulling into Hoi An, which was the port of the Nguyen regime in central Vietnam. That, again, is another example of a port polity state that depends very much on maritime commerce. The city of Hoi An itself is really divided into the Japantown, which is labeled up here, and the Chinatown, the Tojinmachi, that is labeled down here. However, Japan, the Ieyasu's successors turned away from the port polity model and instead embraced the Chinese bureaucratic empire. The other port polities disappear. Again, the ones in Kyushu are absorbed into the unified Japan. Ryukyu is absorbed into the Shimazu domain in the first decade of the 17th century. This Nguyen regime based at Hoi An, after it annexes the Mekong Delta at the late 17th century, also turns to the Chinese bureaucratic agrarian state model. Again, the last hurrah of the port polity is perhaps the Jiang regime that survives until the Qing conquest of Taiwan in 1683. At that point, the port polity disappears from East Asia and also from historical consciousness. This idea that there was an alternative to the Chinese bureaucratic state disappears from our historical consciousness as well. The legacy, however, of the Wokou and the port polity can be seen perhaps in the 18th century Chinese diaspora into Southeast Asia, which also includes a number of cases in which Chinese merchants themselves set up city-states, for example, in the Gulf of Siam, that operate until at least the end of the 18th century. But basically, throughout East Asia, the Chinese model has emerged triumphant over the course of the 17th century. So I think I will finish up there and turn it over to Helen.
And now we're going to make another kind of radical shift in time and place and go to Sunkyu Lee's presentation on maps in Ming China. And again, part of this effort is not only to introduce us to other faculties' research, but also the younger generation of researchers or graduate students in particular. And so it's quite exciting to see what the next generation is bringing to Chinese studies. And with that, I will hand it over to Sunkyu.
Thank you so much. Let me share the screen. I was wondering whether the screen is clear and my voice is clear. Is it?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, great. Yeah, so my name is Sunkyu Lee, a PhD candidate at UCLA History Department. I am currently working on the dissertation on how imaginings of border was changed throughout the Ming Dynasty. So today I'm going to present a part of my dissertation chapter about the changing idea of the Great Wall in the mid-16th century. I'm very grateful for this opportunity because I am in a kind of early stage of drafting this particular chapter. So any comments or suggestions would be extremely helpful. So originally, I advertised that I will discuss two things in today's talk. One is the new historical narrative of the Great Wall, and the other is its cartographic depiction. But due to the limited time, I will focus instead on the first part. So I apologize for the false advertisement, but feel free to reach out to me via email if you're interested in the second part of the topic. My current research was inspired by the book called The Great Wall of China, From History to Myth. Dr. Arthur Wardron challenges the existing myth of an ancient origin and timeless presence of the Great Wall. Instead, he argues that the current form of Great Wall, as you see in his book front page as a stone-made and elaborate defensive structure, only started to be built after the late 1540s. What I found interesting was that some maps printed in the 1530s and 1540s already depicted the Great Wall as if it existed throughout the entire northern frontier. So if you can see, here is the Liaodong province, and then the wall-like structure goes all the way throughout the northern frontier to the Jiawi Pass in Gansu, encircling the entire Ming northern frontier. This map looks contradictory from the fact that some walls did not even exist or was still under construction in the reality. That's when I started to read closely what maps and writings about the Great Wall was actually talking about. So my findings are two. First, maps and writings did not simply reflect what already existed or the Great Wall as a physical structure. Instead, these maps and writings themselves recreated and transformed the idea of the Great Wall. Second, this Great Wall as a conceptual idea interacted with the Great Wall as a physical structure, which was being built during the same period of the time. So in today's talk, I will introduce two examples showing the development of a new historical narrative of the Great Wall in the 1530s and 1540s. Both Wang Qiong and Huan created a new historical narrative, rejecting the existing idea that ancient Great Wall was a negative historical example. Instead, their historical narratives made the contemporaneous wall building more acceptable and even desirable. One of the most well-known stories related to the Great Wall is the legend of Lady Meng or Meng Jiang, whose husband was dead during his conscripted labor of building the Great Wall during the Qin dynasty. The Southern Song illustration captured the dramatic moment that her weeping for the deceased husband brought down a section of a wall. And then her husband's bones were revealed here. So this legend reflects a critical attitude toward the Great Wall, treating it as a symbol of state overexploitation of people, and which led to the early demise of the Qin dynasty. According to Dr. Nicholas Tuckett, such widespread anti-wall sentiment affected later policy choices. For instance, forcing Song politicians to build different types of defense structures other than Long Wall, or in Chinese, Changcheng. This case leads us to the question then, what made difference for the Ming and made the reconstruction of the Great Wall possible during this period? Wei Zhijun's wall, which was often cited as the earliest Ming wall, started in a response to a new geopolitical condition in the 15th century. The Ordos Plain, or in Chinese, Hetao area, is located within the northern loop of the Yellow River. The early Ming court established several forward garrisons, such as Dongxiang. However, due to the budgetary concerns, the court withdrew these forward garrisons in the early 15th century. Later, Mongols took over this area since the mid-15th century with increasing security threats from the Mongols. The Ming officialdom continued to discuss what to do with these circumstances, the loss of the Hetao area, either conduct military campaigns to regain Hetao and reestablish the Yellow River here as a front line, or create a new defense line further south. So like here. And then this is the Wei Huan's map. So this is the Hetao area, this is the Yellow River. And then you can see a new created wall-like structure. Wang Qiong was known as one of pioneer wall builder before the active wall building actually started in the late 1540s. While serving as a supreme commander in 3 garrisons of Shanxi, he proposed and supervised the building of what he called trenches and ramparts. He proposes a linear defensive structure as a necessity for frontier defense. At the same time, he was critical toward earlier wall building efforts, claiming that those walls were either too expensive or too weak. Instead, he suggests that his trenches and ramparts can serve as an effective defensive structure without requiring too much burden. First, he reinterprets an excerpt from the Book of Changes to justify the necessity of such defensive structure. So in the first part, the original text and earlier commentaries focused on where to build defense. So the focus was the character Xian, interpreted here as difficult places, rugged terrains, or strategic places. Wang Qiong's commentaries below emphasize instead the verb she, to highlight that natural barriers themselves are not enough to serve as a barrier, but it requires human investment of labor to fortify and complete it into an effective barrier. However, Wang Qiong's criticism actually reflect the changing function of a wall. Most of the earlier Ming walls were made of earth and clay and easy to be demolished. Although some sections were recently repaired, it is still too low and thin to serve as an effective defensive structure. Before Wang's time, walls did not actually play much role in actual battle, other than giving an alarm for upcoming invasion. It is different from what we imagine now, that a large number of soldiers were arranged on top of the wall and defend against approaching enemies from the other side. Instead, in Wang's time, most generals preferred the strategy called strategy of waiting until enemies actually broke into the wall and scattered to raid, and then making an ambush attack toward a smaller group of enemies. Even though this strategy let enemies plunder the area that belonged to the Ming, this let them raid first and then attack strategy actually made sense. Since wall was simply too long, it would cost too much if soldiers station and defend the entire wall section against enemies. Even if the Ming could afford it, it was not considered effective without knowledge of when and which section of the wall would under attack. Even if some soldiers defend that wall, if, quote, the enemies were up to several tens of thousands, it would be as if the mountain is collapsing over, which even our best soldiers could not stand against. This strategy actually supports some of the existing studies' argument that earlier walls and trenches served more as an economic boundary of state military farms rather than serving for defense. I do not elaborate more details here, but the point is that Wang's criticism suggests a changed expectation that wall has to be sufficiently high and thick, And if it is trenches deep and wide enough to serve as an effective deterrent when Ming was under attack. Wang was not the first person who suggested it. Wang cited another failed attempt by Yang Yiqing's wall building in 1506. Also serving as the supreme commander at that time, Yang proposed to fortify old wall up to 2 which is more or less 6.5 meter or 20 feet in height and thickness, and dig old trenches up to 2 at the same time in depth and width. While Yang mobilized 900 workers to complete it within 4 months. His plan was halted after building only 30 li, which is more or less 10 miles, since the burden was too high. Then how can one build an effective defensive structure without mobilizing a great number of workers? In order to save cost, Wang suggested to dig trenches and make ramparts, instead of constructing solely a wall, as in the Yang's plan. After digging trenches, workers were supposed to use the same earth to build a rampart in the immediate south of the trench, which together would make a barrier of 3 in total. Wang also suggested to build such structures further south compared to the earlier walls. So this map can be confusing because it's upside down. So this is actually the old wall located further north. And then you can see Wang Qiong's trenches and ramparts were actually closer to the fortress where soldiers were stationing. So shortening the distance between the wall and fortresses, Wang expected that soldiers quickly arrive the wall when it is under attack and utilize it in actual battles. He also supervised military drills by making soldiers arranged in ramparts and defend it using firearms toward approaching enemies. In summary, Wang justified the necessity of constructing a new defensive structure. At the same time, he tries to distinguish his project from previous walls. His criticism of earlier walls reframed his new defensive structure as a major breakthrough and helped him avoid the criticism of possible financial burdens. Now I move to Wei Huan's Huangmingji Jiubiankao, which was published more or less a decade later in 1542. In the section of the wall, Jiang, Wei emphasized wall building as the most urgent task for northern frontier defense. Wei actually copied and edited Wang Qiong's Beilu Shiji in the first half of his section. However, Wei discarded Wang Qiong's criticism against earlier walls, instead created a new historical narrative of the Ming Great Wall. Wei opens his section by emphasizing essential differences between Hua, or ethnic Han, and Northern Hu. According to him, wall building policy is inferred from the fundamental difference between their lifestyles. So Northern Hu barbarians have strong cavalry forces due to their nomadic lifestyle, while Chinese dynasties lacked such advantages due to sedentary and agriculture-oriented lifestyle. This distinction itself is not new and actually frequently mentioned in Song Dynasty writings. However, Wei argues that this difference led to the strategic problem that steppe enemies could easily be gathered and strong, while our soldiers were difficult to gather because it cost too much and still weak. Wei concludes that wall is the best solution to solve this problem, since it could block enemies without a large number of stationing soldiers. This essentialist attitude actually differs from Wang Qiong, who himself grew up in Taiyuan, one of the border towns in Shanxi, and often positioned himself as one of frontiersmen to highlight his expertise in frontier affairs. Rather than essentializing ethnocultural differences, Wang Qiong was keenly aware of the porosity of boundaries and actively utilized it to obtain information from local informants and returnees from the other side of the wall. Wei's another major difference from Wang Qiong is that instead of criticizing earlier walls, Wei described as if the Ming Great Wall was in a gradual evolution since 1472. Wang Qiong described with details the vicissitudes of old walls, each of their characteristics and weaknesses. Such details were all erased, and instead, Huan just briefly summarized them into a series of wall construction. For instance, Yang Yiqing's failure was not even mentioned. Instead, his wall plan, which was an actual failure as we saw briefly, was described as a successful story in upgrading and completing the outer defense system. Such narrative created an illusion as if the Ming continued to be involved with wall construction. And as a result, wall was gradually extended and evolved into a comprehensive defensive system in northern frontier. Differences in their materiality and building techniques were translated as the adaptation to local conditions, which is in Chinese 因地制宜. However, rather than showing their differences, the wall served as a homogenizing term, incorporating various kinds of previous structures, which used to have a variety of local social functions, and transforming them as all being a part of the bien, or a defensive boundary. This is what I call a new grand narrative of the Great Wall, as in the title of today's talk. At the end of this history, we suddenly switched to the regent building of wall in Datong, though I didn't include in this table because the space is quite limited. This indicates Wei's intention to claim that walls in Hotao as a collective sum already proved that wall building is the best strategy to deal with northern enemies. And the same strategy must be implemented in other parts of northern frontiers, such as Xuanfu and Datong garrisons, which were more approximate to the capital Beijing. Considering the context that it was under a recent attack and wall building was discussed as a policy option, we actually have a very specific agenda to extend the wall into the northeast section. In summary, during the 16th century, several scholar officers challenged the existing negative connotations associated with the ancient Great Wall, as we see in the legend of Lady Meng. In order to justify the construction of a new defense structure in northern frontiers. Before this period, wall and other boundary markers having various forms and different social functions were treated more or less as a local practice and had a very liminal or fragmentary presence in the archive or in a historical narrative. Wang Qiong describes what wall has to be and what it has to look like, but he still compares various different materials, strengths and weaknesses, and required cost among them, in order to reject the existing notion that long wall is bad because it costs too much. In contrast, Wei creates a linear evolutionary and unifying narrative of the Great Wall. He collected scattered records and examples and rearranged them according to the chronology, and he reproduces them as a part of a singular defensive structure. So in my opinion, Wei Huan's narrative shares similarities with our modern imagination of the Great Wall in two aspects. One is the notion that the wall represents an absolute boundary between two societies that economically, ecologically, ethnoculturally different from each other. The other is any differences in terms of materiality and social functions were ignored in the excuse of local adaptations, while the notion that the wall as a single, continuous, existing and evolving structure remained intact. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your presentation, Sunkyu, and three very different but equally engaging presentations. And the floor is now open. We do have a few questions in our queue already. And I'm gonna, first question is from Lena Nia, and I'm gonna see if I can allow her to ask her question herself. Let's see if we can bring her in. Lena, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me in today's wonderful sharing session. So I have a question for Professor von Glahn. So I wonder, from the Songyuan period to the Ming, I wonder, was there any significant changes in terms of what kind of goods and what kind of currency that Japan wanted from China, and how, and if there are such changes, then how does it enrich our understanding of economic history during this transition period? Thank you. It might be a too big question.
Well, thank you, Lena, for that question. Yeah, there is a very significant change. The first real big boom of Sino-Japanese trade begins in the late 12th century, and it's really organized around the export of Chinese bronze coins to Japan at a time in which Japan no longer was producing any currency of its own. And this has enormous implications for Japan. It really sets off a commercial revolution in Japan, and things like land rents and tax revenues are much more monetized as a result in the next few centuries in Japan than they are in China. Down to the period that I was talking about, Japan was wholly reliant on imports of Chinese-made coin as their currency. Among the things that the Chinese were most interested in getting from the Japanese at that point in time was sulfur for gunpowder weapons, which were very extensively used, as Tony Andrade's research now shows us, in the Song period as well, not for guns in our conventional sense, but for explosives, what we might call hand grenades, and also for projectiles, the so-called huojian, or fire arrows that were projected using gunpowder, both sort of arrows and lances even. That was the main thing that the Chinese were interested in. But this trade undergoes significant transformation already in the 15th century, because the Ming dynasty, after its failed experiment with paper money, also suspends its coinage. After the 1530s and down until, after the 1430s and down to the 1530s, the Ming government is not minting any coin whatsoever. Lots of private coiners step in to replace the official coin with their own rather substandard, but the market didn't have much choice, and so they begin to use these private coins, and that flows into Japan as well. The Japanese aren't very happy about the now substandard coin that they are receiving. So what happens by the 16th century is that imports of Chinese coin really diminish, but the export of silver is in exchange for imports of Chinese silks. And the Japanese silk manufacture really takes off in the 16th century using Chinese either cloth or yarn, but of course cut and dyed for Japanese clothing styles. But overwhelmingly, the exchange of silver from Japan is for Chinese silks. So we have this reversal in the flow of monetary metals from the 12th century down to the end of the 15th century. It's the monetary metal bronze coins is going from China to Japan, and then from the 16th century and until the end of the 17th century, it is the Japanese silver that is coming into China, and the Japanese silver is still much more quantitatively much more significant than the American silver well into the 17th century. So that's what's really fueling the commercial boom of the late Ming period.
I see. Thank you. So they are in a like a mutual beneficial relationship in different time periods, right?
As good Ricardian trade theory would tell us, yes, all sides benefit.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. As we're awaiting additional questions, please indicate you want to ask a question in the Q&A slot if you have anything, but I will jump in with a question to fill the void, so to speak. And one question for everyone that I think might be useful for some of our graduate students who are in the meeting is if you could talk a little bit about the methodology that you used in terms of the current project you presented today. How did you discover the project? What materials are you using? I know Helen mentioned she was writing a book and then it kind of morphed into this film. And how did that shift maybe, and how did working on the film later inform the current book project and maybe even bring a different sensibility of narrative, of storytelling, of how did that impact the monograph you're working on? If everybody could just share a little bit about the kind of process of your research project you talked about. Thank you.
Would you like us to go in the order of presentations?
Sure, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, well, this is an extension of work I was doing in Chinese monetary history, which I think is sort of my home base in terms of research and worked on for many years. Michael made mention of my 1996 book, Fountain of Fortune, which looks at the Chinese monetary system during this period from Song to end of Ming. And as an economic historian, I simply followed the money. And that took me to Japan. As I said, the big story from the 12th century onward in East Asian trade is the export of Chinese bronze currency to Japan. And once I got to Japan, I discovered that the Japanese sources were far richer for studying things like actual monetary use and regional differences, what kinds of coins are being used, where and by whom, different levels of the economy and so forth. So then I wound up really looking at the way in which Chinese coins were used in the Japanese context. Again, the sources for Japan were just much richer on these issues than the Chinese sources were. And that then kind of extended into a general interest in maritime exchange for perhaps 2 decades now. There's been a big boom in studying Japan in an East Asian perspective and a maritime perspective in Japan itself. It hasn't quite translated into Western scholarship on Japan, but this is a really hot topic in Japan. And so there's an enormous amount of research that's being done and has been done now by Japanese scholars who, in contrast to the traditional, very sort of insular, literally insular, perspective on Japan as a unique and separate world, are really looking at the exchanges with the rest of East Asia and even beyond. And so I've been collaborating with these scholars in this kind of research. Some of the images that I showed today come out of the co-research that I've been doing with Japanese scholars.
For methodology, I think I focus on both textual analysis and visual analysis. So try to make sense that map is not just illustrating what was written or what we think, but it also has like an independent, like a performative function in shaping the reality. So yeah, that's what I thought about methodology currently. Yeah. And since Professor Berry said I am the next person for asking questions, I would just go ahead. I have two questions for Professor von Glahn's presentation. First is very specific question related to my own research about the use of firearms, because in the sources I used, they also frequently mentioned about the existing guns they were using, or they call it 神枪, like a 贵神的神, and then 佛朗机枪. So I was wondering if you are familiar with any existing research about how the Portuguese guns were imported and circulated even across the different borders at that time, and how the society was kind of grasping and understanding the knowledge of making it, or is it just purely relied on the import of the Portuguese guns? That's my first question. The second one is that I was wondering how I guess maybe it's a new concept of port polities, how it is similar or different from the kind of earlier period maritime connections, and also during pretty much the contemporaneous period of European kind of, it's not yet colonialism, but like kind of maritime networks. So how you frame this case in the context, temporal context and special context of the bigger frame. I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Sunkyu. First of all, on the weapons, of course, Tonio Andrade's work and his recent book on this is a key source. The Portuguese, as I was saying, that gunpowder weapons go well back into at least the Song period, and the extent to which the Chinese were using gunpowder weapons or having them used against them, as it often was the case in the Song and Mongol period, has been overlooked. But they, again, given the massive quantities of sulfur that were being imported from Japan in the 12th, 13th centuries, gives us some sense of the scale of how important gunpowder weapons were. The Portuguese, of course, introduced a new technology. But everybody complains that there aren't enough Portuguese guns. And so one of the big competitions in Kyushu certainly is everyone's trying to develop relations with the Portuguese and trying to develop exclusive relations so that they, and not their rivals, have access to the Portuguese guns. There is a long-standing narrative. It's that the Portuguese introduced gunpowder weapons to Japan. I think it's actually the Wokou who introduced Portuguese weapons rather than the Portuguese themselves being the people who are carrying these weapons to Japan. The Meng Wokou Wars are very much a story of gunpowder weaponry, and indeed the successes in the late 1550s, 60s in Fujian, sort of the last stage of the Wokou Wars, which were supervised on the Chinese side by the famous General Guang. He himself, as Andrade points out, was an important innovator. So what's happening is that the Chinese and then the Japanese as well are taking the new technologies that are introduced by the Portuguese and reverse engineering them to make their own copies of them, and in some cases, their own variations of them. So it's really not a question of Portuguese guns so much as the basic technology that is absorbed very quickly on all sides, the Ming, the Wokou, and the Japanese, the various contending powers in Japan itself, that is really producing these weapons now, but using Portuguese models, but very much making them locally. On the second question of the port polity and its possible precedents, I'm not sure that there are, and of course there are what we might call city-states, especially in Southeast Asia at an early point in time. And I guess I don't know enough to claim whether or not they might have been port polities. Certainly when we get into the 18th century, this is a very strong phenomenon throughout maritime Southeast Asia, both indigenous and, as I said, in some cases, Chinese governed port polities that are ringing the oceans of Southeast Asia in the 18th century. But I think as a kind of conscious strategy of political economy, this is something that's new. In the 15th, 16th centuries, again, I would say the prototype is really Wokou, which had the advantage of, since there was a ban on trade, on overseas trade by the Chinese, but Wokou had very active trading relations with the Ming and many Japanese partners. Again, they varied among whoever was the leading contending power in Japan going back to the 15th century. So Wokou became the linchpin of maritime trade in the 15th century because it was the one place that could trade with everyone. And so the Chinese and Japanese, I pointed out another phenomenon that we see with this port polity is the overseas merchant colonies, as I showed in Huan, a city that was entirely populated by Chinese and Japanese. The Portuguese and Dutch weren't allowed in. The Chinese and Japanese kept them out. And this is something that's happening in Naha, the capital of the Wokou Kingdom, where you have these side-by-side Chinese and Japanese merchant communities. The Wokou have to sort of keep them apart. They're not, although they're trading with each other, they're not always on friendly terms. And so the port there is also essentially populated by foreign merchants, and but very much deliberately cultivated by the Wokou kings as their source of income, since obviously they didn't have a whole lot of agrarian lands to rely on. So I think that's a model that really emerges at that point in time, and as I said, eventually persists into the 18th century, spreads to Southeast Asia, even though it disappears from East Asia.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I'll jump in with a question for Sunkyu. We all know that even today, the Great Wall looms as this kind of mythic symbol of China. It's kind of imbued in all kinds of cultural coding is projected onto it. So I'm curious, from the period you're looking at, the Ming Dynasty, the ways in which the Great Wall is imagined, and what pieces of that continue on up until the present day, and which pieces of that story fall off and are abandoned in terms of a renewed imagination of what the Great Wall is today. I just kind of wonder if you could trace the continuity of that cultural imagination of this site over time a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I wish I can clarify it, but yeah, I will try. Yeah, what I think interesting in Wei Huan's story is that he basically justified the wall building. So that's a kind of major breakthrough from the previous period, because previously, I think most of the writings kind of tried to avoid even the mentioning of Changcheng. They tried to conceptualize it in a different way. So it is not Changcheng, but they were actually building, and they were kind of keep reminded that it is actually similar with the Great Wall they are thinking. So, but then after Wei Huan, I gradually see more and more mentioning about kind of giving positive connotations with the Changcheng. So it is a Sinic practice, and even one of the authors in 1560s, it is actually interesting because he's Fujian native, so he has no expertise, he has no background, but he still says Changcheng is one of the 3 major inventions by ancient sage kings and wise rulers. So they gradually make this kind of narrative. One is that it is necessary because it's kind of a Sinic practice invented by their sage king to protect the humanity or something. And then the other thing is that it is, yeah, so the first thing is that it is conceptualized as more ethnoculture way, which is quite similar in, I think, modern PRC terminology, even though I think their special unit is kind of bigger. So they kind of try to handle that, how the northern Hu barbarians and Chinese were interacting with each other in their modern archaeological practice. But anyway, so the first thing is that it is defined as ethnoculture terms. The other one is kind of linear development of the Great Wall. So previously, there was no continuous attempt to define it as their contemporaneous war as a part of continuation from the ancient Great Wall. But then now they gradually make that connections more clear and even acknowledge it. So I think that linear evolution of the Great Wall, it is actually very similar with what we now see about the Great Wall. So it was what at one time, like in many millennia ago, it was invented, and then it somehow kept reappearing and developed and then extended all throughout the northern frontier. So yeah, I think in that two ways, it is kind of similar with the modern PRC understanding of the Great Wall. Yeah.
Thank you. So we're running short on time. Do our panelists have any final questions for each other, or anyone in the audience have a question before we wrap up? If not, I will take this opportunity to once again thank, Esther, our Assistant Director of the Center, for all of her help, the technical staff from the International Institute, and of course, all of our three wonderful presenters and our audience. Thank you all for sharing your time this beautiful afternoon with us online. Please, if you're not already subscribed to the Center for Chinese Studies mailing list, you can go to our website and sign up. We also have a Facebook page, a YouTube channel, and we will have more events this quarter. Early next month, Zhang Ling, a well-known Chinese writer, will be doing an event with us. We are working on a teach-in dealing with Han-Uyghur relations in Xinjiang, which will probably be in December, and a whole bunch of other events. So please stay tuned to the mailing list to find out about that. But again, thanks again to everybody. We appreciate it and look forward to seeing you at future events. Take care, everyone.